Another taboo is to celebrate European culture. Multiculturalists get pretty unhappy when Europeans start expressing pride in their culture or heritage.
The medieval Europeans identified 7 deadly sins for a reason, and one of them was pride. And that doesn't mean that, well, there's nothing valuable about European culture. There's plenty about it that's valuable. It's not even so clear to what degree it's European. I mean, it came out of the Middle East, you know.
Jordan Peterson does not understand Western civilization. As I'm sure is also the case for many of you, Jordan Peterson was kind of my gateway into this whole world. I loved his biblical series lectures, and I used to be a big fan of his. But the more I learn about European history, the more I read European literature, and begin to gain a holistic understanding of quote-unquote Western civilization, of European civilization, the more I begin to realize that Jordan Peterson's understanding of the West is really shallow at best, to the point of even being deceptive. When Jordan Peterson talks about quote-unquote Western civilization, he really focuses on the ideas of logos and reason and the individual. And he traces the development of these ideas through Christianity to the Old Testament to Mesopotamia, even citing older Mesopotamian culture, right? The Enuma Elish, in which Marduk conquers Tiamat. And so, in doing so, he essentially traces the origins of Western civilization to the Middle East. But that's a bit strange. That's not Western at all, right? Europe has its own traditions which stretch into prehistory. Why is he tracing the origins of Western civilization, which is basically a proxy for saying European civilization, to the East? So this is actually quite strange. Jordan Peterson's conception of Western civilization actually completely ignores the long native history of Europe and European culture, European values, the history of the European peoples. Jordan Peterson basically traces everything which he finds of value in the West back to Christianity, which is a relatively late arrival in the history of the West. And when Christianity did arrive, it joined an already existent tradition. It joined and was integrated with an already existent tradition by an already existent people. Western civilization didn't just pop out of thin air. It didn't just miraculously come into being with the arrival of Christianity in Europe. At the least, the Greeks and the Romans already had well-established civilizations before the arrival of Christianity. And again, that's not even delving into the whole prehistory of Europe and the origins of the European peoples, their values, their culture. And what's more, Jordan Peterson's idea of logos and reason, the rational individual, is really a product of liberal enlightenment thought, liberal enlightenment Christianity. So he doesn't even really trace the origin of what he considers to be the core Western values back to Mesopotamia. I mean, he basically traces it back to Enlightenment Christianity. And of course, you can then draw a genealogy from there, perhaps back to the Old Testament, perhaps back to ancient Mesopotamia. But if we take Jordan Peterson's definition of Western civilization based on these core ideas which he believes makes the West great, then the West didn't really even exist until the 17th century, and of course that makes no sense at all. Elements of distinctly European culture can be observed as early as the entry of the steppe peoples, of the Indo-Europeans, into Europe. And I would say Europe's story probably starts even earlier than that, but we can definitively say that with the entry of the steppe peoples into Europe, and with their cultural and genetic mixing with the populations that were already there, we get basically all of the elements which would go on to create what we call Europe genetically and culturally. And Jordan Peterson never mentions any of this. The languages of Europe can all be traced back to the reconstructed Proto-Indo-European language which came in with the steppe peoples. The languages of Europe did not originate in the Near East. They're not related to Hebrew. They are Indo-European languages, not Semitic languages. You know, we don't speak Babylonian, we don't speak Hebrew. Jordan Peterson never mentions that. Think how important language is to a people's worldview. Our values are built into our very language. In Latin, bellus stems from bonus, bonus meaning good, and bellus therefore meaning a little good thing. So beauty is a little good thing. Beauty is linked to goodness. Jordan Peterson talks so much about language, but he never talks about the value system which is implicit in European languages, the connection between the beautiful and the good and the upright and the noble, to be true, to be beautiful. These are all connected. This seems like something which Jordan Peterson would love to talk about, and yet he never even mentions it. Instead, he talks about how the word meek in the Bible doesn't really mean meek. Instead, it means someone who has a sword but keeps it sheathed. And I've actually never been able to find that interpretation of the line, and don't really see how that would actually make any sense in context. In fact, we can read it right now from the Sermon on the Mount. Quote, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be filled. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the pure in heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are those who are persecuted because of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." End quote. And Jordan Peterson tries to connect this passage to the Nietzsche quote, "Verily I have often laughed at those who thought they were good because they had no claws," saying that you need to be dangerous in order to be a good man, but I don't see that meaning in this passage at all. So he's grasping at straws in these biblical lines while completely ignoring all of the rich stuff which you could get into about the value system implicit in European languages and European cultures, which does not have an origin in the Near East. And Nietzsche, of course, talks about this stuff all the time, but Jordan Peterson never mentions any of that when talking about Nietzsche either. Jordan Peterson says he loves Nietzsche, and yet he almost never talks about Nietzsche except for to occasionally misquote what he said about the death of God. People comment on my videos all the time, "Nietzsche didn't think the death of God was a good thing. He said it as a warning. He mourned the death of God." But actually, Nietzsche did say that the death of God was a good thing, and that it should be celebrated because it would pave the way for a revaluation of values, a new value system essentially based on ancient European pagan values, which had been inverted by Christianity. But let's get back on topic here. The fact of the matter is that every European society in history, until perhaps very, very recently, has been based on the native values and culture of Europe, which can be traced back at least to the arrival of the steppe peoples in Europe, which took place long before the Bible, I'll have you know. Again, Christianity was a relatively late arrival onto the scene in Europe, and while it did change the landscape of European culture, for the most part it was integrated into the pre-existing structures, culture, values of Europe. When Europeans adopted Christianity, it's not like they started from scratch. There was a blank slate. The languages which they had always spoken continued, their customs continued, their traditional forms of government, their traditional religious practices for the most part, and it actually took a long time for Europe to even Christianize. In fact, I would argue that Europe might have not even fully Christianized until the Enlightenment, and that is only, again, very, very recently that we've had this idea that European countries are based in Christianity and Christianity alone and Christian values. And what's more, the European values which Jordan Peterson celebrates have a history in Europe long before Christianity. Let's take the idea of logos, of the divinity of speech, which Jordan Peterson talks about so often. There has always been a rich oral and literary tradition in Europe. Look at the Norse idea of runes, the magic of the runes. Look at Homer, these rich oral traditions which were passed on and then written down. Look at all of the literature of the Greeks and of the Romans, the fantastic Roman oratory. A compilation of pre-Christian European literature would far exceed the length of the Bible. The Icelanders wrote over 100 sagas alone, and yet Jordan Peterson frames it like the Hebrews were the first people to discover writing, and the Europeans were all running around illiterate before Christianity came and taught them the value of words and of the Bible and of the book, when this is not true at all. Europeans were already fascinated with literature, with language, and with stories. And the same goes for forms of government. Jordan Peterson and liberals in general like this idea that liberal democracy is based in Christian values, or Judeo-Christian values as they now say, but this isn't true at all. The forms of the democracy and the republic do not come from the Near East. They do not come from Christianity. They do not come from the Bible. These forms of government came out of Europe. Among the Greeks, the Romans, the Germanic tribes, you see the form of the democracy and the republic, or various forms of the democracy and the republic, forms of government which required voting, even in the case where there were kings. You can see that these government systems are actually native and natural to Europe. They are part of Europe's pre-Christian culture. The Spartans and the Greeks in general prided themselves on being free men. That's how they differentiated themselves from the Persians. They said the Persians, they are despots. They are ruled over by tyrants. Not us. We are free men, and we will not serve an emperor. We will not serve a king. In the Roman Republic, you found the same sentiment. The Romans hated kings. They hated tyrants. They prided themselves on their republicanism, and it took quite a lot to reach the point where they had an imperial system. And even then, the emperor would call himself princeps, first citizen. And during the Christian Middle Ages, the most common form of government was monarchy. So clearly, democracy is not at all rooted in Christianity or Near Eastern traditions. This is native to Europe. And in fact, the impulse behind liberalism, maybe not the core principles of liberalism, which I will admit are very Christian, but the core impulse behind liberalism comes out of the pagan tradition, out of the native European tradition. It's not imported. And it's the same in the realm of morality. As I've talked about in other videos, Europe had romance before Christianity. You have precursors to the idea of romance in the story of Jason and Medea all throughout Greek literature, Penelope and Odysseus in the Norse sagas. And you have, of course, love in the Bible, but it's not this romantic love, this distinctly heroic vision of love. Europe had monogamy. Monogamy was the standard. Of course, rich men would have concubines, like Achilles has concubines, but, the standard was monogamy. If you look at the biblical tradition, that's not the case so much, And of course, Europe had a complex moral system, and a lot of the virtues which Christians or trad Christians like to say are Christian virtues, valuing the family, ideas of honor, courage, manly virtue. Virtue, a Latin word, again, pre-Christian Latin word, all come from the pagan tradition. Europe had complex government, Europe had literature, Europe had morality, all before Christianity. These things are not imported. So Jordan Peterson effectively outsources European identity to other cultures and makes it so that any pride which one has in the West actually comes out of pride in the abandonment of historic European values and cultures. He shares this attitude which many Christians unfortunately have, that Europe before Christianity was dark and barbaric, which of course is completely ridiculous. And this is the same attitude you see among liberals, right? You can have pride in the West from a liberal perspective, so long as it's pride in liberal values. We love the West because it is free and open, and we have feminism and so on. But, before the Enlightenment, before liberalism, we were barbaric. We are good because we actually abandoned our barbaric ways. We are good because we woke up, we became enlightened, either by liberal morality or Christian morality, and before that we were just awful. We are good because we realized how evil we are, how awful we are, because we've repented for the original sin of our barbarity, of the patriarchy, of paganism. So whether you take up the mainstream liberal or conservative position today, you cannot love European heritage for what it is. You have to outsource it to something else, either the morality of the Bible brought in by the Hebrews into Europe, which enlightened us, or liberal morality, which enlightened us. It's taboo to actually look at what historic European values are. So taboo that Jordan Peterson never even touches on any of this stuff. Occasionally he'll mention the ancient Greeks, who mention Socrates and Plato, but he'll never look at what Nietzsche talks about in Genealogy of Morals, the native European value system, the idea that the beautiful, the noble, the excellent, the upright, and the true, and the good are all one and the same, the idea of the aristos, the idea of nature as the basis rather than history, the idea of excellence as the goal rather than morality, the idea of life as a divine hierarchy, the idea of divinity and immortal life being found in the body, in reproduction, in the ideas of biology and ancestry. Jordan Peterson never touches on any of these ideas, and if asked about them, I'm sure he would probably avoid the question, finding it to be too taboo. But in these things, in the pages of the Iliad, the Odyssey, the Homeric hymns, and Norse literature, you will find a window to what the West really is, what values, what foundations the West is really built upon, the actual threads which bind Western civilization together, which have run through every European civilization since the cultural and genetic inception of Europe.
And so these right-wingers in this, it's like, look what we've done. It's like, no, it's not you that did that. That's something, man. You gotta have your act together before you would dare to say, well, that was me. It's like, yeah, sure it was you.
All who came before us are dead, and we are the remainders. All I know is that we will see each other again. In Valhalla. In Odin's Hall. And we will be young again. We will be fierce and proud. We will laugh and sing. The gods will embrace us. We will be what we were always meant to be. And so this is life. And so is this death.
It gladdens me to know that Odin prepares for a feast. Soon I shall be drinking ale from curved horns. This hero that comes into Valhalla does not lament his death. The Aesir will welcome me. My death comes without apology. And I welcome the Valkyries to summon me home. I shall not enter Odin's hall with fear. There, I shall wait for my sons to join me. And when they do, I will bask in their tales of triumph.